Tiga singo kwagala wasena bitegese tewemenya Kuwanga kwa mutonze kwa singo kwagala wene wachikutegeza nenenya So baby babaleta and I'm babaleta Sichiwakanya chiche chitezo Wengamba make a link up I saw a link up Kwagala nyewe simyo recho So missing you, never I'm busy. I'm busy. My energy. Diggy, 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 da da da. Diggy da. I'm on a backwards floor. Come take a chair. Diggy, 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 da da da. Diggy da. Bigger, 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 boy, come get better. Diggy, 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 da da da. Diggy da. Man never could dance slow. Come take a chair. Diggy, 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 da da da. Diggy da. Bigger, 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 boy, come get better.
Yeah, it's working. Is everybody back in the room? All right. Yeah, welcome back. I hope you all had a good break. I think I forgot to introduce myself yesterday. I'm Paul Clich, also a student at the University of Duisburg-Essen, and I've also assisted in organizing the summer school. We are now starting with our first regular lecture given by Jakob Capella, whom I shall briefly introduce to you. So Jakob, in his own words, is a philosopher who only accidentally became an economist. He currently serves as professor at our Institute for Social Economics at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany. And he also heads the Institute for Comprehensive Analysis of the Economy at the Johannes Kepler University in Linz, which is in Austria. Jakob's research focuses mostly on socio-economic change from a political economy perspective, but he also works on the history of economic and political ideas, on philosophy of the social sciences, and on distributional issues. But there's one topic that I, as a student, have heard Jakob talk about passionately many, many times, which is heterodox economics. And yeah, so I'm excited for you to hear what he has to say about this topic now in his lecture on the introduction of orthodox versus heterodox economics. So please welcome Jakob Capella.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Paul, for the nice introduction, and many thanks for having me at this stage. As Paul has indicated, I'm a professor for pluralist economics, and the idea of pluralism in economics is to bring together different perspectives and different theories and try to get some value added and to get some merit out of the recombination or comparison of different theories. In my talk, I want to convince you a little bit that this pluralist approach is a good approach, but it also has a second function. It has the second function to introduce a little bit the distinction between orthodox or mainstream economics on the one hand and heterodox economics on the other hand. We just heard in Fred's talks a mentioning of Kuznets theory. This is a mainstream theory of development and distribution. And in contrast to that, there are heterodox theories. And when we talk about wealth inequality, the dynamics of how wealth changes over time and how this is also related to issues of development, we will often find ourselves in a situation where heterodox approaches and theories can give us an additional benefit, additional insights that are often lost in the mainstream approaches. So let me ask you before going into the details, can everybody in this room who has ever heard of heterodox economics before raise his or her hand? Okay, great. Then it's a very good thing we have this talk, because I think it gives us a grounding and a foundation for concisely and seriously discussing the issue of wealth inequality, although wealth inequality itself will only play a minor role in my talk. Okay, let's start. When we talk about pluralism in economics, we typically talk about 3 different topics. For one, we can discuss how to justify pluralism. Do we really need pluralism? Is there a merit to considering different theories and so on? So we can give a justification. Second thing we can do is to analyze pluralism. How diverse is economics? Is economics maybe already pluralist? How does economics deal with competing hypotheses? And the third thing we could do is simply do pluralism. We could ask ourselves, how could a pluralist research strategy work? We could ask ourselves how to incorporate a broader body of theories, and then it comes to the question, what is heterodox economics? And then my talk, I will try to spotlight all these 3 streams in the correct order. So we start with justifying pluralism. What, if any, is the merit of pluralism? And in what follows, I will give you 3 key reasons and also maybe some examples why I think that pluralism is important. The first point is very foundational, and it's about the role of pluralism in theory of science. And I really like this quote here by Karl Popper, who says, "Whenever a theory appears to you as the only possible one, take this as a sign that you have neither understood the theory nor the problem which it was intended to solve." And what Popper is referring here is, of course, his central idea of fallibilism. Every statement on empirical relations is in principle fallible from a logical point of view. It can be wrong because we lack the means or we lack any method to definitely prove that an empirical hypothesis is true with certainty. And Popper's solution was to say, okay, if we cannot prove for certainty that something is true, we can do critical tests and keep our eyes open and look for the alternative explanations that are maybe out there. And then we can at least compare different approaches and explanations and move forward from there. So the core lesson to take from this quote is, for serious research in economics and elsewhere, we always have to be willing and eager to look beyond what we already know, to be open for alternatives, to actively seek out alternative explanation for the phenomena of interest. And here we already come to the first problem. Namely that economics is not at all pluralist. Economics is dominated by what is called a mainstream economic approach, sometimes called also neoclassical economics. And the mainstream approach rests on these big tomes, on the economic textbooks you all know, introductory micro, advanced micro, introductory macro, advanced macro, all this stuff. This is in the textbooks, and basically what mainstream economics is doing is it does research on topics and models and ideas surrounding these textbooks. And then there are people not so happy with this situation because either they think that the textbooks models are not that great, or because they think they are lopsided. They maybe miss something, although they can be useful for some instance. And we call these guys dissenters. And we can find such dissenters both in the mainstream, critical neoclassical researchers like Joseph Stiglitz or Paul Krugman or Thomas Piketty, and we can find such dissenters outside of the mainstream, and there we find the heterodox schools of thought. I've listed some here: ecological economics, which starts basically from nature as a core vantage point and from planetary boundaries as a core vantage point. Post-Keynesianism, which basically tries to take the works of John Maynard Keynes really seriously. Feminist economics that contrasts the more masculine androcentric perspective of neoclassical economics with alternative perspectives focusing on care, reproduction work, alternative understandings of provisioning, and so on. We have here the institutionalists who are deeply convinced that we cannot analyze the economy in isolation, but always have to relate it to society, culture, politics, and of course nature. We have evolutionary economists who juxtapose the mainstream of idea that everything will rest in an equilibrium with the idea that everything is constantly changing. Everything is dynamic in economic context. Everything is always in flux. And then I've mentioned also a curious school, the Austrian School of Economics, which is often remembered for its contribution to neoliberal ideology. The list of heterodox schools is not exhaustive. I have, for example, in this graph simply left out the Marxists or radicals, as you could call them, not because I do not like them, but simply because I forgot to add them in this slide. So there is a longer list to make. What is a shared feature of these heterodox dissenters, and the reason they are heterodox, is that they reject the foundational assumptions of the textbook. They say basically, hey, we want to use different foundational assumptions, not perfect competition in markets, not rational individuals that always optimize. There should be alternatives. And we claim that these alternatives are also more realistic and hence better equipped to describe what's going on in the economy. And making more realistic assumptions, this is a common experience of all those heterodox schools, making more realistic assumption often brings in additional complexity. And by seeking such different foundational assumptions with greater realism, heterodox economics effectively takes a step back, going back to political economy, and features an understanding where we basically say the economy cannot be analyzed in isolation. We have to take into account the interplay with society, and we also have to take into account that the economy is embedded in nature. So here is a quote that expresses that political economy, heterodox economics, is coined by an all-pervading awareness that political and other non-economic factors play an important role in shaping economic processes and results. So a first takeaway here is that we would so to say, draw from this claim of realist assumption the idea that economies are embedded. And by making this claim that economies are embedded, things get more complex. We can less easily use reductionist abstract methods. This brings me to my second reason why we should foster a pluralist approach. Pluralism is a great tool to come to grips with the complexity of social reality. As expressed by Kurt Rothschild here, a plurality of paradigms in economics and in the social sciences in general is not only an obvious fact, but also a necessary and desirable phenomenon in a very complex and continually changing subject. Now, why are economic subjects so complex? So one reason is multicausality. Any economic phenomenon will typically have a multitude of causes which interact with each other, and it will have more than one consequence. And we can illustrate this very quickly by simply saying, let's take some phenomenon like the increase in economic inequality here, and list some sources, which factors are driving this increase in inequality, and then we will find several answers. We will find that tax policy is playing a role. How progressive are our tax systems? How much incentive do we have for firms not to pay too high or too low wages? Globalization is a factor. If there is freedom to capital flows, capital becomes more powerful by definition, and it's then more successful in its struggle for rent against workers or other groups. At the same time, taking power as a direct factor, we find that worker power has been decreasing, both in the developed as well as in the developing world over the last decades, at least for those cases where some workers' movements exist. Then we already had in the last talk skill-biased technological change. If technology changes, education becomes a reinforcement factor driving inequalities because those not being able to come up with the necessary capabilities and skills drop out of the labor market or drop into a low-wage sector. And finally, we often find that regulations labor market regulations will directly feed into the hierarchy we observe into the labor markets. An example is the emergence of working poor in Europe, which was basically not present 50 years ago, but due to legal changes it became possible to employ people at lower wages, so that we also have this phenomenon of working poor. And another example is CEO pay. If you look, for example, in the US, on data on CEO pay, you will see that this explodes at the end of the 70s, early 80s, because of the introduction of stock options as an additional means of payment. So we also have to be keen to look at this interplay between institutional setup and how this plays into labor market hierarchies. And this list is not yet exhaustive, and maybe these are not even the most important reason, but we see many factors play into that. And the same on the side of the consequences. More economic inequality will mean less expenditures, because poor people typically spend all their income, whereas rich people do not. So we have a decrease in aggregate demand. We will also find that greater inequality will lead to more poverty, which has impact on health, physically as well as mental health. More poverty is typically associated with a worse state of health when viewed from the aggregate. We also know that inequality has an influence on politics, because the greater the inequality is, the greater the influence for economic elites, for very rich actors. And of course, inequality also impacts on our well-being. So what we typically observe, especially in the developed countries, is that GDP rises over the last decade, but subjective well-being has stopped rising in the early 80s. It's still an open question why this is the case, but increasing inequality is a key candidate explaining why increasing GDP does not feed back on increasing well-being. And finally, of course, inequality creates financial fragility. We could also take this insight from Fred's great talk we heard at the beginning today, because simply if we have less capabilities at the bottom of the distribution, we will have more non-performing loans, more defaults, and at the same time more money at the top. Money at the top is always bored, I'd like to say, and because it's so bored, it always seeks opportunities. So we have more speculation, and speculation can again create instability. So how unequal or equal our society is will have repercussion on the stability of financial markets. So this is my one point here. Socioeconomic phenomena are subject to multi-causality, and to really get a grip on a phenomenon, we have to take this multi-causality into account. But there is a second punchline, a second takeaway in this slide, because if you look now at different economic theories, different traditions of economic thought, we will find that these different traditions have their preferred pet subjects or their preferred mechanisms, which they tend to look first. For example, from a neoclassical perspective where you emphasize scarcity and optimization, the first thing that these guys find interesting in this map is typically still biased technological change. Because there you can say, we have education, and we can conceive of education or human capital as something scarce, and then we can use our usual tools. So this is why we like to go for this strain of argument. For a Keynesian, on the other hand, the first thing a Keynesian would always say, I think it's in their genes, is, wow, rising inequality will decrease demand. And this will worsen economic growth and potentially decrease our GDP. And for evolutionary economists, it's especially interesting it's an agenda to develop a more realistic perspective on the psychology of agents. So what these guys do is to analyze subjective well-being, and and try to answer this question: why does well-being not increase if GDP increases? So we will typically find that economic schools, economic paradigms, will tend to favor those causal chains that fit very well into their preconception. and they will have to take more effort if they also want to analyze other causal changes mapped here. So I hope you could take something from this example. Let's wrap it up a little. In the social sciences, I always like to say God gave physics the easy problems, okay? Because in physics you can always control everything and do controlled experiments. In the social sciences, everything is messy and diverse. Social phenomena are multifaceted, diverse, they are changing over time. And how to deal with that? One way to deal with this problem is simply to take a variety of perspectives, of theoretical perspectives, and see these perspectives, these different theories, like different maps that we can use for diverse tasks. We use one map for driving a car, another for going hiking, and the next one for navigating a ship. So these different maps are not antagonistic, they are rather complementary and can be used in combination. We have to find out how exactly to combine them, maybe. We have to combine them in the right way to get better answers and better solutions. And this basic idea that different theories are not necessarily antagonistic, but also can be used complementary, this has been anticipated by many great thinkers, and one is, of course, John Maynard Keynes, who said, economics is a science of thinking in terms of models. Economists write up models. Joined to the art of choosing models which are relevant to the contemporary world. Every economic model is an abstraction, is a reduction in some way. And if I abstract from the wrong things, I will get a bad analysis. Okay? It's very simple. So we have to think very carefully, not only about how to be very analytically cool and write up a nice model, but we also have to reflect which model fits the purpose, which model does the task. I've collected some examples here. I will not go through all of them, but one such example for this socio-historical specificity of economic mechanisms is related to the distribution of wealth. In empirical data, we observe that nearly every society has a distribution of wealth that follows a so-called power law. Power law is, following a power law distribution is simply a formal way to say there is huge inequality. Okay? There's typically always huge inequality when it comes to wealth, except in hunter-gatherer societies because they do not have property. And these societies typically have uniform distributions. So basically, whether we find uniform wealth distributions which are rather equal or power law wealth distributions which are super unequal depends on a historical condition. I mean, is there private property? Private property related to some means of production. Another example would be credit markets. So in history, we repeatedly observe that when there is a money shortage, informal credit markets will emerge where people lend each other money. If I lend you $100, we will increase the money supply informally because now I still have the 100 euros as a claim, and then the total money supply rises, okay? And when we look historically, in what conditions can this kind of informal credit supply compensate for a money shortage, then we find it will typically only happen in situations where there are tight social networks and high trust, because this is a condition for these informal credit markets to emerge. So as you see, if we strive for a better historical, socio-historical contextualization of arguments, we can effectively make our theories more precise. And I have an example here also on inflation. I compare inflation in Germany with inflation in Uganda to give you a grasp of that. So this is the chart for inflation in Germany. It starts in 1860, so it's a 150-year chart. And what you can see is that after World War II, in the second half of the graph, inflation is much smoother. Whereas before World War I, in the part on the left side of the graph, inflation was very volatile. So the nature of inflation as a social problem changed. before 1900, we have a low average inflation, lower than 2%. But the problem for the people was the volatility. You had 1 year with 15% and another year with -10. On average, you come close to 0, but in practical terms, this is a huge challenge for consumers and producers alike. Whereas in the phase past World War I, in the phase after World War II, we have a higher inflation, it's closer to 3%, but we have low volatility, and we have also politically managed inflation because after World War II, we indexed wages with inflation, which means that rising inflation is less of a problem for the people than in earlier times where we did not have such an index. Okay? And now if a German economist comes to Uganda and wants to understand inflation, he will probably think of inflation like in this period after World War II and try to conceptualize the phenomenon in this way. But if we look at the data, we see that this volatile curve for inflation in Uganda looks much closer to Germany 150 years ago. And in both cases, we find that the prices for primary goods, especially food, are a key driver of inflation dynamics. Okay? And peeking into the literature, I found that the local scholars have a sensitivity for that. So I have found this paper about inflation dynamics in Uganda, where it basically says world food prices, supply and demand effects in the agricultural sector are main causes. If you give that to a standard global north economist, he will probably not even understand what is meant here. But with a historical perspective, we can compare that to Germany 150 years ago and say, okay, actually, the dynamics of inflation in Uganda are probably closer to what we observed in Germany 100 years ago than to what we have observed in Germany over the last decade. And without an awareness for this different relevance of different mechanisms, we will probably make the wrong decisions. I will not go into details here, but I have added, so to say, this more pedagogic slide that, so to say, makes this case even fuller and says, okay, we can have several cases of increasing inflation. It can either come from bargaining power of workers, like in conflict inflation, the case 1 in the upper right hand. It can come from an increase in input costs, higher costs for primary goods, or it can really come, case 3 in the upper left corner, from true scarcities, from hard constraints on capacity, as is often the case with food if you have a bad harvest. So this is just, so to say, to see where this goes. From simple example, we can try to build a typology of different cases and then compare. If we observe some inflation dynamic, then look, okay, which case could be the driver, which theoretical argument could be the driver in our empirical case. Okay, we already had 2 reasons for pluralism in economics. One was the general argument that this is a key factor for scientific advancement. The second was to come better to grips with the complexity of social reality. And the third one is pinned down here. We find that if we do not have a multitude of theories, a plurality of theories, we will often have tendencies where the dominant approaches simply immunizes itself against critique. Okay, and this will have a tendency, as pinned down here, where we have a situation where facts, so empirical facts, are used only for illustration or backup of the predominant theory by interpreting them in a compliant way. And indeed, we find many examples of such compliant interpretations in mainstream economics. One example is behavioral economics. So here is the loss aversion. Do you know what the loss aversion is? It's a finding in behavioral economics that we value things we already have slightly higher than the same things we could get. Okay? As soon as we have something, we value it slightly higher. And here I found this cartoon on the web trying to explain the loss aversion, but it's wrong, so I have to correct it. Basically, loss aversion compares losing $10 to not winning $10. And in the experiments we find if we lose $10, people are sad, oh cruel world. If we not win $10, although it's the same amount of money, we say, okay, it's not such a big deal. I had the opportunity, but I did not win it. So we are emotionally more strongly affected if we lose something we already have, okay? For a neoclassical economist, this is super stupid because it's always $10. It's the same thing. It's a bias. And the bias is not with the statistic and is not with the theory, but the bias is with the subjects, okay? Subjects, people, humans are inherently biased in this perspective. And this is an example for such a compliant interpretation. Okay, I have a theory which says $10 are $10, no matter whether I already have it or whether I can win it. The data says, no, it makes a difference for humans. The economist says, okay, the humans must be broken. Huh? See the pattern? And this is, of course, problematic, okay? So what is missing here is, again, this search for alternatives. And one alternative would be an evolutionary economics rational heuristics approach, where we basically say, okay, optimization is very exhausting. Humans typically use mental shortcuts. And one such mental shortcuts could be that the things I already have, I have for sure. Whereas the things I will get from Resti tomorrow are also quite sure, but not 100%. Huh? And maybe this is, our mind is taking this into account as a shortcut. So we can strive for alternative theories that maybe really explain this thing without attributing simply an intellectual defect to our subjects. Second example, global income distribution. Now we are getting a little closer to our inequality topic. Do you know this famous chart, the elephant curve? It has been quite a hassle on Twitter, so let me explain it to you. What you see here is the global income distribution in 1988, okay? And what you then have on the y-axis is growth of real income at this position in the 20 years that followed, from 1988 to 2008. And then you see basically the highest growth rates are in the middle of the distribution. The lowest growth rates are for this segment here, which is basically middle-class people in US and Europe. And then we have also high growth at the top. Okay, and when you ask a mainstream economist, whoa, how is this to be interpreted? He will say, the clear conclusion from this graph is that capitalism works. Capitalism works for catching up, because as you see, greatest growth rates are in the middle, there is some catching up process, and all we have to accept is that also the global elite, the top 1%, top 2%, they also gain something. But for this price, we have convergence, and that's a cool thing. And we can see how capitalism really benefits anyone. So this is called the elephant curve. You see here, I've drawn an elephant into it. Okay? And yeah, in my view, this is again it's not wrong, but it's a compliant interpretation of the data. You know, if you grow by 80% in the middle of the distribution, you start from $10 a day, you grow plus 8. If you start from $100,000 a day in the top of the distribution, plus 60% means plus 60,000. So we lose sight of the huge absolute differences that we start from. And so it's good to ask another question. The second question we should ask, if all the growth that was created in the world economy in these 20 years, if we imagine that as a pie, and we ask how was this pie of growth distributed, we will get the following picture. We will see that more than half of world GDP growth in this period went to the top 5% of the global income distribution because they had such high values to start from. So I would not say the elephant is wrong. These are the same data. They are just plotted and presented in a different way. The elephant still tells us an important story, but it has to be complemented by the giraffe. Without the giraffe, that stands for the second question, how was this pie of growth distributed? We cannot tell the full story. We need at least two animals, okay? At least two animals. And this is exactly the old problem with paradigms. There is a famous book from the 1960s on the structure of scientific revolutions. How does science change over time? When is a theory evaporated and gets replaced by another? And he says that researchers from different paradigms, they look at the same data, like this picture, or the data on the income distribution we had before, but they see different things. And to explain this, Kuhn used this picture, which you can either see as a rabbit or as a duck, depending on which mental perspective you take on the picture. So that's it for my first part, justifying pluralism. Why do we need pluralism? Why can it be helpful? And I hope I could give you some impression in this context on how this can contribute to a better understanding of our problems and also to an improved position for developing research strategies and the like. This brings me to the second part of my talk, analyzing pluralism. How can we understand that we have this strange thing like the orthodox-heterodox divide? These labels, orthodox, heterodox, does anyone know where they come from? Yeah? Yeah, that's correct, the conventional from the unconventional. But actually these terms, they come from theology, no? The orthodox is the true belief, and the heterodox is the other belief. And you know the other belief is very often the wrong belief. So this is, yeah. Exactly. The first thing that is interesting from a pluralist perspective is, okay, if there are heterodox and orthodox economists, do these guys talk to each other? And to find that out, we have done citation analysis, and you see a major result here on the right side, namely that the heterodox journals depicted on the right side of the graph, they do cite mainstream papers to a large degree, that's the purple bar. And they also do cite heterodox papers. However, in the dominant section, in the orthodox journals, we find almost complete neglect of heterodox ideas. And that's a very typical thing in the sciences. Once a dominant approach is established, alternative approaches will tend to get ignored. Okay? And this is something we really see very visibly in the data. So basically, many mainstream economists will not have a clear-cut idea what heterodox economics is, and will not have an idea, very definitely not have an idea what these guys do in their research. This was not always the case. If we look back historically, we can distinguish three phases. A pluralist phase till about the Great Depression or World War II, where we have in the history of economic thought a great variety of theoretical traditions and also very many regional idiosyncrasies. So basically, economists that were locally successful because their theories fit the problems of their time, okay? Of their time and place, and not too much because their approaches fit with the dominant understanding of what economics is. Then there was the Great Depression and World War II, and after World War II we have this strange hybrid approach that's called neoclassical synthesis, where basically out of this pluralist phase early on, neoclassical economics becomes the dominant approach for microeconomics, so analyzing economic actions of individual entities, whereas for macroeconomics and also for economic policy, we have a boiled down version of Keynesianism, sometimes called neo-Keynesianism. And then you have this division of labor, but basically neoclassicals are responsible for the micro side, and this boiled down version of Keynesianism does the economic policy and the macroeconomic steering. Then there is the oil crisis and the Volcker shock, and in the developed countries, this was, I would say, used also as an opportunity to get rid of the remains of Keynesianism in the standard approach, and basically since the early 1980s, you have a full-fledged neoclassical dominance as the sole accepted approach within the discipline. And of course, the economics discipline is a very global thing. Typically, when you're an economist in Austria, and probably even more so in Uganda, what you do will be judged against the archetype of what US economists do. Okay? And this is how this kind of hegemony is reproduced. Again, this is what brings us to this status quo, where we have one dominant approach that makes up 97% of the discipline, and we have these more renegade heterodox approaches that make up the rest and try to posit some alternatives. And again, tracing this historically, we find that still in the 1950s, there was a shared discourse between mainstream and heterodox guys, but the neoclassical approach decided to close the discipline, and one very visible institutional mechanism to do so is simply to not anymore accept heterodox contributions in leading economic journals. Okay, that these guys, the heterodox authors, prominent institutionalists, Marxists, Keynesians found, oh, all my manuscripts get rejected. And they do not get rejected because my research became worse, because 10 years ago my papers were still accepted, but they are no longer accepted because the mentality of the discipline has changed. So we can very clearly trace this exodus of heterodoxy by tracing the creation of new journals. The Journal of Economic Issues, a prime outlet for institutionalist economic research, was, in parallel with the Review of Radical Political Economics, a prime outlet for radical and Marxist analysis, founded in the late 1960s as a response to this closure of the discipline. Keynesians followed about a decade later with the foundation of the Cambridge Journal of Economics and the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, and then another 10 years later, we have ecological economics, and ecological economics basically even started with founding their own journal to have an intellectual platform to do things differently, to think in terms of conceptual alternatives. So we can very clearly trace this exodus of heterodox authors by inspecting this history of the discipline from an institutional perspective. In sum, things are, as so often, best summarized by Rothschild. This is, I think, now the third quote, and you can infer that this guy is a kind of hero for me. He said, the confrontation heterodoxy versus mainstream exists because of the contemporary scientific regime in the discipline of economics, which is coined by a strong bias towards a neoclassical mainstream. A focus on this approach is underlying most study programs and plays a crucial role for a career in economics. And as you can get from this quote, if you want to become an economist, maybe even a professor in economics or so, you see that it's favorable for you to adopt the neoclassical approach because the institutional setup is lopsided. And this is also exactly what Kuhn told us in his classic account on scientific revolutions. Scientific paradigms work in a way where they exhibit self-reinforcing effects. And that means that once a paradigm is established, it's very difficult to ankle it out, so to say, out of its secure position, because the most feedback loops we have in science are positive feedback loops. If you are an attractive paradigm, you have more practitioners. If you have more practitioners, you have more pupils. You can solve more problems, publish more papers, create more citations. Bam, that's a positive feedback loop. Okay? And as you can see from the graph, there are these circles with pluses, and every circle is a positive feedback loop. So basically, we have a case of self-reinforcing positive feedback effects that creates path dependency. And here is a very interesting link to our major topic of wealth inequality, but because such self-reinforcing effects also play a role in wealth accumulation, and they also play a role when it comes to the question of how to accumulate visibility and prestige. If we look at YouTube views, we will find that they have a similar distribution as the wealth distribution, because social media are also governed by these positive feedback effects, even reinforced by the algorithms, okay? But the same holds, for example, for citations. You see here 3 graphs. Upper left is a wealth distribution, a very typical wealth distribution, plotted from the richest to the poorest guy, okay? It's not really the richest because there is missing data problems, but... And if you plot a wealth distribution from the richest to the poorest guy, you will always get this shape here, where basically all, for the large part of the populations, the values are very close to 0. But there are a few giants who have a lot of wealth, and this creates this graphical impression of this broken curve. Citations to articles in the American Economic Review look similar, because dynamics of visibility and attentions are governed by analogous mechanisms of self-reinforcing effects. Okay? And to also indicate how special this kind of distribution of the data is, I took a variable that is normally distributed, namely the birth weight of 35 newborn babies, which the data I scraped from the internet by hand. This is a classically normal distribution, the thing that we typically have in mind when we think about the distribution, a normal Gaussian standard distribution. If you plot that from highest to lowest value, it would give you something like this close to a straight line. Okay? So you have a visual impression how these visibility dynamics in science differ from a standard variable, and how this is also again related to wealth and gives us a similar shape and impression. Okay, now you could ask, okay, Jacob, could you explain a little more in detail how these positive feedback effects really emerge in an academic discipline? So I've put up these slides that list some reasons, and I will not go into details. It has to do with publication possibilities. It has to do with the audience that is reading your papers and can give you citations. It has to do with the job market. There are not so many jobs out there that say, oh, we would also employ a heterodox economist if he's well qualified. Typically, jobs are only for the mainstreamers. It has feedback effects, of course, in university education and training. It has feedback effects on your prospects to achieve third-party funding and so on. So what I typically do, I feel as an economist, but when I try to submit a grant proposal, I rather do it in physics because you can convince these guys with good mathematics, and then they will let you go. But the economists will say, this is not the thing we have in the textbook. This has to be kicked out. Or you try with the sociologists. You go for the sociologists' money because they will say, okay, this seems like an acceptable approach and does not sound like delusional nonsense that is coming from economics. Then you have a chance. But if you go to economics, they will say, come on, this is an astrologer. He does not use the textbook stuff. So these are the kind of feedback effects. I've also added 2 graphs here that simply show that because of these feedback effects, the share of mainstream people in economics is even increasing. So here in Germany, from 80% to 95% from the 70s to today. That's the purple line at the top. Or here in the US, from 70% again to, the line is at 100% at the end of the line. So close to complete neoclassical. And some critical mainstreamers also see this, that there is only this one approach and that this one approach potentially comes with blind spots. And I'm very sympathetic hence to this statement by George Akerlof, who clearly has an awareness for this. He says, what I'm worried about most of all is what we don't see. So I'm worried about the analysis that is never seen, that never becomes a paper, and it doesn't become a paper because it can't become a paper. It's even close to a rap song. And it can't become a paper because that's not what a paper in economics is all about. Okay? If you have a different basic vantage point, you're out. And Ekelov here is quite worried that this creates blind spot or vacuums, as he called it, and we know that such vacuums exist. Okay, I've made my major points here to simply illustrate how this neoclassical dominance is the result of a historical process and how this can be contextualized, analyzed, and discussed. And as a remainder, I wanted just to indicate, because I think that's very important here, although the slide is probably too small to read, that economics is a discipline full of borders and class ceilings. So what you see here is a graph collecting the institutions of authors in the 30 most important economic journals, okay? And what we find is huge concentration. We find that the top 10 institutions, I think they're all in the US, LSE has dropped out, they're all in the US. The top 10 universities have a share of 17% of all authorships in the top 30 journals. There are so many universities out there, but only 10 universities have this great share of 17% of all of most important economic publications. If we go to the top 20 institutions, it becomes 25%. Even worse, and even higher concentration we observe when we do not ask, where are you employed? But if we ask instead, dear authors, where did you get your PhD from? Then we find that 40% of all authors in these top 30 economic journals will have gotten their PhD from only 10 different universities. See this huge institutional concentration we have here, where basically there is a glass ceiling. There is a glass ceiling for everyone that is not working in the US, for everyone who has not done his or her PhD in the US, for everyone that does not work with US data. Even that creates glass ceilings in economics. And then I do not even speak about the well-researched fact that we have a lack of representation of both women as well as minorities within economics. So, final funny chart. You see here two charts for two specific journals. Left is the Quarterly Journal of Economics. Right is the Journal of Political Economy, two really big journals, okay? And we see here that one university has captured a large share in the QGE, and another one has captured a large share in the Journal of Political Economy. And I have a note here. The Quarterly Journal of Economics on the left is edited at Harvard and MIT, which is why place 1 and 2 in this ranking are Harvard and MIT, okay? Whereas the Journal of Political Economy is edited at Chicago, which is here at rank 1, Chicago. So you see how this works. It works basically it's not only about quality or genius, it's really about who knows whom, who has studied where, who is deemed credible because people know you, and so on, and so forth. Origin and relations in this way always matter, of course, but they seemingly matter a little more in economics, because otherwise I can't see how it comes to these sharp deviations in acceptance rates. So far, so good. We're now approaching the final part of the talk, and I think will be roughly in time. So for the final part of the talk, I will speak a little bit about doing pluralism, and the idea is really to use this as an opportunity to introduce a little more details and a little more clearly also what heterodox economics is, or what I believe it is. Very often, we find definitions like this one, where heterodox economics is framed as the idea of simply a collection of those in opposition, okay? The quote here says, one can define heterodox economics negatively in opposition to either orthodoxy or the mainstream, And then the same author says a little further down below, another possibility would be to define heterodox economics positively as an intellectual category that is not defined exclusively in opposition to orthodox. But when applying this positive concept historically, the result may be an empty set. Okay, because this author fears there's too much incoherence between these schools of thought. But there are also other voices. For example, if you look up the Heterodox Economics newsletter, this is a scientific community service providing the latest news about what's going on in heterodox economics. You will find also a segment on what is heterodox economics, and there is this quote. Heterodox economics is an umbrella term covering various strands of economic thought as well as a series of interdisciplinary research fields. While heterodox economics is highly diversified, most heterodox economists agree on certain conceptual definitions. For example, that doing economics is to study the process of social provisioning, agree on certain theoretical foundations, for example, the role of uncertainty in economic action, the importance of principles of effective demand and endogenous money, or we could also add here that, for example, power relations, power asymmetries play a crucial role. So there is a series of shared convictions among heterodox economists, and the idea is that we can all nicely talk together within a pluralist engagement. Now this comes quite authoritative because it says that the Heterodox Economics newsletter said that, but I should be honest here, so I wrote that because I'm the editor of this newsletter. But still, when I took the editorship a decade ago, I wanted to give it a spin where we can say, okay, now we have much more in common, guys, than just agreeing that the mainstream is somehow, some would say stupid, others would say misled, others would say misleading. There are different strengths of opinions here, of course, but so to say, being solely left with the mainstream approach creates blind spot and weakness. So I'm a defender of a positive approach. Let's search for the commonalities, let's search for the common anchor points. And on this basis, I ask myself, okay, what are such shared anchoring points? I mean, for the mainstream, this is quite clear and super easily explained. We have this idea of scarce means. Scarce means have to be allocated to competing ends. We should do that rationally to have an optimal solution. If we have found an optimal solution by optimization, the system becomes quiet, is in equilibrium, nothing happens anymore. This is the standard approach. Now we have some problem, this changes the scarce means or the competing ends, then we have to do optimization, and then we have to find a quiet state for the system. What is the pre-analytical vision, as Schumpeter called these ones, of heterodoxy? What ideas do we have before the analysis starts? So first I would say that heterodox economists do agree on a basic question, and the basic question is not about rational allocation of resources, but is rather how do people organize their livelihood and their societies. How do people organize their livelihood and how do societies organize their provisioning? Okay, this is the idea. How do people organize their livelihood? How do societies organize provisioning processes? And this is a broader question, and it's basically going back to the questions Adam Smith, David Ricardo et al. Ask, because they ask what are economic activities and what are the interesting social and economic political phenomena surrounding these economic activities. And by asking the question for provisioning systems, we basically go back to that approach. We look at the economic side of things without abstracting too much. So here is Smith, just to indicate that we actually go back to the roots here. Second argument is on ontology. So mainstream always starts from the individual because only an individual can optimize. But this can again lead us to overlook things. So in contrast, heterodox economists would start from a systems-based approach where we basically say, okay, we have social systems of different scale, of different complexity, and these social systems are composed and upheld by relations between people. So we bring in this interpersonal relational side of things and also this macro view by emphasizing the role of systems. And as a consequence, we can have top-down mechanisms and bottom-up mechanisms. We can have an interaction of agency and structure, as it is sometimes called. We do not have to accept this dogmatic stance that every solid analysis starts from the individual, starts from the agent, and then we have to build everything from there. A third commonality is something I already emphasized, namely the embedded economy. In heterodox economics, most people agree that nature, society, and economy are intertwined on an essential level and hence mutually dependent. History matters because everything is then past dependent, and also science is not a neutral observer somewhere out there, but science is part of the process because science itself is also subject to this embedding in society, culture, and nature. For economic systems always develop, they never rest, as the idea of equilibrium would suggest. They are always in flux, as you could say, and these developments are again driven by human actors that are related to each other. They are typically driven by interconnected individuals that form or create social systems. And in heterodox economics, we can conceptualize these connections in different ways. For a mainstream perspective, connection would mean that we have some trade agreement, some contract, some deal. But for a heterodox perspective, we have a broader understanding of relations. We can conceptualize relations as trust, as money flows, also as contracts. But we can conceptualize relations in terms of power, asymmetric or symmetric power relations, in terms of information flows, or in terms of standard economic circular flows. So we have a varied conception of this relation term, and think that it makes sense, depending on your question and context, to interpret human relations differently depending on your question. And finally, inequality. In the standard mainstream approach, inequality explains nothing. It is not an explanatory variable. It's simply a result of individual productivities. So it's an outcome, but it does not itself act as a reason. This is different in heterodox economics. We believe that the degree of equality or inequality structures society. For example, it creates social classes that are obviously there, and other forms of stratification. So in heterodox economics, we accept the challenge to conceptualize inequality as a core explanatory variable that is also interesting and that has an impact on economic processes, whereas in contrast in mainstream, it's often a residual of individual productivities. So this is already something, no? 5 basic ideas that serve as a first foundation, or as I called here, as a pre-analytical vision. We could even go in greater details. For example, this table tries to juxtapose mainstream and heterodox views on a textbook level. And in this table, there are some items that you have already been confronted with. For example, in the mainstream, we conceive of the economy as a problem of rational allocation, whereas in heterodoxy, we conceive it as a problem of social provisioning. We do believe that the economy is embedded in society, whereas our mainstream colleagues prefer to analyze it as if it were independent of society. We already had those two. This is something new. The mainstream typically conceptualizes capitalist dynamics as a form of a steady state process, so as a stable growth process typically. Whereas in heterodox economics, you will find many views that say, no, capitalism is inherently unstable from a financial perspective, from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, and especially from an ecological perspective. Again, we have distribution here. Is it primarily an outcome of processes, or is it a relevant input? We also have some items here about markets. What are markets there for? In mainstream, it's price equilibration. In heterodoxy, ideas like power and also innovation come in. And also how market outcomes are exactly determined is contested. The next two items here refer to the financial sector and free trade, and also have some repercussions for the topic we discussed this week. In the mainstream view, the financial sector is an efficient intermediary. So if the financial sector grows, the reason must be that we need more financial services, and the growth of the financial sector will be efficient. It will create additional efficiency. Whereas in heterodox economics, we conceive the financial sector rather as a force that tries to systematically appropriate assets, rents, profits. And this appropriation can be conducive to social goals, but it can also be destructive. So we have to conceive, we would conceive the financial sector as a potentially destabilizing force, because in its hunt for additional income, additional rents, additional profit, additional things to exploit, it can destabilize societies, nature, and so on. Also, the notion of free trade is something that does not come without ideological and political connotations. No, if we follow the mainstream view and say free trade from a theoretical perspective is mainly an extension of our production possibilities, yet then it's undoubtedly something nice to have, because we have more possibilities. It's good for everyone. But from a heterodox perspective, we would be much more careful, much more critical here. We would argue that we see in globalization that what we have is a race for the best location. Many countries are lowering their taxes on profits because they want to attract additional firms. Okay? But then we have not a competition between firms. We have a competition between nations for the benefit of firms. This is something we should avoid, actually. And in this perspective, globalization is maybe not that great of a thing. And coming with this race for the best location, we also have path dependence. I discussed this already with 3 different taxi drivers here in Kampala. They all raise, you say you're an economist, every taxi driver will raise the question of development. And then you basically have a 10-minute discussion, and then the agreement is, taxi drivers are really good economists, I found here. The agreement is, these kind of path dependencies in international trade, they create traps, because it's very difficult if you're a producer or if you provide the world market with primary goods or maybe food or so. It's very difficult to jump up the ladder and sell sophisticated technology tomorrow, because all this is path dependent. This is what's the case. Okay, you see here how this distinction between heterodox and orthoeconomics directly pertains on the issues that then impact on wealth accumulation. And to have some basic awareness for these different approaches was a main idea why we should have this talk. I have some additional items in the table which relate to the theories of choice, which I will not comment because of lack of time, but you should know that heterodox economics also have an alternative theory of choice. So in concluding, we could go back to the history of thought, and I really like this textbook on the history of thought by Scribanti and Zamagni because it's so inclusive. And in the beginning of this textbook, they have this nice quote: on some subjects and fundamental problems, base orientations are formed which give rise to strands of research which span the history of economic thought. They are like rivers on limestone, which sometimes disappear underground before they come to light again, when nobody expects it. And I would argue that some of these points of contentions, are economies stable or unstable, are outcomes determined by supply and demand? Is value something objective or something subjective? Is money exogenous or endogenous? Is distribution a result of power differentials or of productivity differentials? All these points of contention are reflected in the conflict between mainstream and heterodox thought. So I would argue that these long-standing rivers that, so to say, stand for age-old questions in economics that can be confronted with different answers, these rivers are reflected in the debate and regularly pop up in the debate on heterodox versus orthodox economics. Okay, so one key final finding would be to say, okay, we can really use this distinction, this juxtaposition, to get a grip on the grand questions of economics. And finally, we have the idea that by doing so, by addressing these grand questions from a different complementary perspective, heterodox economics is really economics. But because it fills so many blind spots and has no institutional anchoring in traditional economics departments, we find from a discursive perspective that heterodox economics is more some kind of generalist social science, ready to diffuse its ideas in a series of disciplines and traditions. We could also pose this another way and ask, if economics is dominated by the mainstream, how have heterodox economists survived? And one answer is, they have survived by interdisciplinary cooperation. So I again close with a citation network. You can read nothing, just see many colors. But what we did in this graph was to analyze who cites, if the other economists do not cite the heterodox scholars, who cites them? And what we found is a lot of people. Sociologists do. In development studies, they cite us a lot. Business administration researchers cite us a lot. Ecological natural science guys cite us a lot. So if we divide that in these different colors, we will find that heterodox ideas play a strong role in development studies, in management studies, in economic geography and international political economy. It feeds also into policy discourses by means of heterodox macroeconomics and the history of economics. So what you have, in my view, is not a club of those who are unhappy with the state of the economic disciplines, but I think what you have is a generalist social science that has many ties to different disciplines and is today of a very interdisciplinary nature and character. So we have this generalist social science that gives us some foundations. We also can use it as an umbrella term, simply collecting these traditions that oppose the mainstream. We see that it has a series of relations to classical political economy in the tradition of Smith and so on. And that's my main point probably, it can be practiced as an open-minded endeavor that provides many anchor points, both in theoretical conceptual terms, but also in terms of interdisciplinary orientations and which theories to connect to. Many, many thanks for your attention. Okay, we have about 10 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Professor Jakob. I am not officially the MC today, but I will step in to support the question and answer session. As we did yesterday, I think, or I like to think that it's good we take 3 questions from one side and 3 questions from another side. And then if we have enough time, we can take a second round because we only have around 12 minutes to lunch. Please make the questions brief because we want to be able to give everyone an opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. Mine is a simple one. Thank you very much. The information has been so informative, and we will actually use it to build our ideologies as far as political economy and heteroeconomics is concerned. So I just wonder whether we will have time to share that very information on our email that we have shared with us here, so that we will further our reading shortly after here. I thank you very much.
If we don't have a question on this side, okay, let's start here.
Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. From this, I understand that heterodox economics is an emerging discipline within economics as a discipline. Now, my question is, just like we know Adam Smith and others, Keynes, as the fathers of economics, in the neoclassical and maybe classical economics. Now, in this new economics discipline, what are some of the theorists and theory that underpins this emerging discipline, sub-discipline, really? Thank you.
One more question. I'd seen another hand.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the presentation. From your presentation, I see we are having also another serious fight. Like, you know, we used to have hard science versus soft science. I really want to pick your brain about your experience about this challenge we have about the mainstream and heterodoxic, economics. Because my issue is, for the moment, we need to for instance, look at what works in a society, for instance. And then if this mainstream economics doesn't really work, in any case, when you mention that heterodoxy is about, it's like social science, that in the end can actually help society to solve their problem organically. So let me know what you've experienced. Because now when you compare, for instance, things to do with Harvard, MIT, Chicago, versus the rest, then, and these guys are very resistant to what's happening, then you see we have a big fight in our hands, and maybe it will keep us just rotating in one place, and we're not going to develop if you have to look at the economic progress as a very serious issue in that sense. Thank you.
Jakob and I are going to talk at great length of the distinction between the concepts and understandings of wealth inequality this afternoon from a heterodox versus neoclassical position. I want to make a few very quick points, though. There is tension, even among the economics, heterodox economists like myself and Jakob, about the actual value of neoclassical economics. And I'm a bit more hard-hitting, as some others are, because neoclassical economics has done an enormous disservice to the world and been incredibly destructive. We'll go in great length, and we'll give some examples this afternoon. And the biggest problem is that its inability, as some of the anti-autism group in France, which started the critiques among the graduate students of orthodox economics, is an inability to address the extant problems in the world. And when it addresses the extant problems of the world with the underlying methodology, it often makes things worse. And there's also the relationship between neoclassical economics which actually reproduces itself not only in the manner that Jakob says, but because it does great service for people with wealth and power. And we need to talk about it. It's incredibly instrumental. Now, the other aspect which is really central here is it, in some senses, is paradigmatic, but it's a special kind of paradigm. Because it has created an inability. Paradigms are supposed to evolve into new paradigms when there are extant issues and statistics and things that are not going to be understood. There's a long history of that, basically Newtonian physics evolving because it couldn't explain ether, and then it evolved into new theories, eventually into quantum physics. You don't get that in economics. And the reason why, and this is one other aspect which I want to emphasize methodologically, is economics is axiomatic. In essence, what you have is a core of self-understood truths that are, in some senses, entirely, they have a complete inability for criticism. Because by nature, an axiomatic position in reasoning is one which actually cannot be in any ways undermined. And that core component is what is taught, and this is what's been understood in neoclassical economics. It's not just in the United States. It's reproduced here in Africa with enormous consequences, because when you generate policies from neoclassical economics, it has undermined and reproduced the structures and weaknesses in African economics. We'll talk about that. The final thing I want to say is that, is that the structures of power, and what was absolutely crucial, and I want to emphasize this in pointed out by Jakob, was the ability to get control of journals and then set the criteria for advancement and appointment in all the top universities, which reproduces knowledge through the acceptance of journals' articles in those special journals. It was an enormous an element of monopolization and power control, which actually then reproduced knowledge and perpetuated a position. But problem, of course, is that African countries are not, and African economists actually don't participate. There's a very good article by Grieve Chelwa on this, which came out in the same issue, which I wrote a paper on how neoclassical economics became institutionalized in Africa, which is really central to read. It does not and is incapable of addressing the problems in this part of the world and in others. And when it begins to address it, we get the destruction we've seen, like, for example, neoliberalism, which has neoclassical economics. But we'll talk about more of this in the afternoon. But I want to emphasize a few of these points. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Professor Jakob, I invite you to respond.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this great question. For one, we will of course share the presentation. Actually, we plan to collect all the presentations so that you have them as a PDF file. And I can have a look, maybe supply 1 or 2 additional readings on this pluralism thing. I think in the readings I provided, I really focused more on wealth inequality, but I will check and maybe also provide an extension here. Regarding the second question on the relation to classical economics, I mean, I think the simple thing is that there is, of course, a relation between classical and neoclassical economics, but the trick is, I would say, that the neoclassical guys take those parts of the great minds, so to say, that suit them, and they leave out those parts that create problems with their models. So if you take Keynes as an example, they, in the 60s, 70s, they sometimes took this idea of effective demand as something that has to be taken seriously, because they could somehow, to some degree, bring it into their modeling approaches. However, they totally left out, for example, the idea of fundamental uncertainty, because this would invalidate rational choice calculus. And they also bracketed largely out the idea of endogenous money. And there you see very neatly, so basically that the mainstream takes over those parts that are somehow compatible with its framework, but it tends to neglect that parts that are less compatible. And this is even more clear with Adam Smith. Adam Smith's greatest contribution, which every school kid in my country knows, is the pin factory. And the pin factory is a story about increasing returns to scale. Yeah, but we never do increasing returns to scale because all our models would explode, no? So this is the key reason there. So all of Smith's very important argument on industrial production, increasing returns to scale, and correspondingly the size of the market that then determines how much you can push this automatization, all that is, in my view, largely lost in the neoclassical approach, although there will be some specialized papers that probably tackle that. So I think we can tell many stories about how these great minds have been appropriated and what parts of their ideas have been left out. The big fight, I mean, I would say it's quite interesting actually. In neoclassical economics, we have a very narrow understanding of science, and we would say probably it's the hardest social science or so. But this is, if you look at heterodox economics, we start from, there are, for example, qualitative methods like ethnographies and interviews in heterodox economics. But there's also a branch that's called econophysics, where the physics guys come in and come with computational techniques that the mainstreamers cannot follow. So in terms of this hard-soft distinction, heterodox economics is really extremely broad. It can be completely non-mathematical, non-formal, non-statistical, but it also has branches where you cannot follow the equation because the guys from the natural sciences come and say, hey, you have problems in the social sciences, let's give it a try. Then they give it a try, and then you have to learn maths for a week to follow the argument. So there is really a huge breadth in heterodox economics, and I think in terms of paradigmatic conflict, this could be a huge asset, because really this idea of soft and hard methods and which is superior, this is largely transcended in economics, and so in heterodox economics. So we are beyond that. So I think in the greater discourse, what is the right approach, so to say, heterodox or orthodox or maybe pluralist, this breadth, this methodological breadth of heterodox economics is, in my view, a great asset and also an indication that many people in this sphere do serious research. Yeah, and in closing, let me say one word to hard-hitting Howard. Hard-hitting Howard is, of course, right. Yeah, you're totally right. I think we do not have any difference in opinion. The one thing where potentially our perspectives differ is that you really emphasize, and I agree, I think, with everything you said on this, you really emphasize the political impact and also how it impacted on Africa. Whereas in my talk, I took the liberty of totally abstracting from this political impact. Otherwise, I would have told you stories about how neoclassical economics contributed to neoliberal hegemony. I was really a bookworm academic in this talk. So this leads to a less appealing and maybe more patient position, but it is not really, I would say, in hard conflict with the hard punches made by Howard. In this spirit, let's do that.
Yes, Doctor. I would like to take another round of questions. Lunch is a little bit behind schedule, so we might take a little bit more time. So it's both unfortunate for those who are hungry, but fortunate for those who still want to have a conversation. So I'll take a question from Doctor, then the gentleman here, and one more. Yes. Please be brief. It's a polite request, but it's important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This story of the dominance of the orthodoxy, this reality, we have 190 plus countries, right? Is there any country that is an outlier in this regard, where you have a different balance of force between these two camps? Or is there a particular region where you have something different going on for whatever historical or political reason? So, or is it that 190 plus countries have that same pattern? And what does that tell us? So it's really important to get a feel a bit also for variety, if there's any. And also in terms of regions, yeah, is Asia maybe different? And do we have strong heterodox economists in particular countries also advising presidents and governments? So can you highlight particular maybe examples that we can follow up later where you have influential heterodox? And then maybe to the second point, maybe before we go into lunch and before you go into the social inequality story, maybe we can dig more into that link between the orthodox superstars, so to speak, especially in America, and the think tanks, and advising US government and other governments around the world and reform, etc., so that we really have a clear maybe starting point for the next session about that, the role of orthodox super authors and their super theories, right? In reforming and reproducing capitalism and so on, and basically also with working some of the most intriguing intelligence and government organizations, etc. So that alliance of forces and the role of economists and therefore scientists, right? Highly regarded textbooks, students read them, don't know sometimes the backstory of their political activities. So just maybe if you can spend a few minutes on that important political role they do and the service they provide for empire and others.
Hi. Hi. Thanks so much for that presentation. I was wondering, since you were talking about journals, if you could also comment on the global north, global south inequalities within academic publication. I mean, one of the things that's even within heterodox sort of publications, there's also mainstream versus non-mainstream, and there's definitely a global north, global south divide. A lot of research that's done in universities, in the global south, are often ignored, or they're kind of repurposed in global north, which means the researchers that have done the research get politely, a polite word would be get ignored. But I think also is there a case somehow for a different industry to be generated that speaks to the context? So, as an example, in India, there are very powerful journals that look at the Indian context, and they're the ones that are always accessed by policymakers. Often I find elsewhere, people in other countries, policymakers and academics would rather go look in American journals and try to bring that and reproduce it in their context. So yeah, a comment on that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is about, I want to give an example of China, which adopted orthodox approach with socialism, then it has adopted the orthodox globalization, and now we are in the fourth industrial revolution. It has also taken over, and it has lifted more people from poverty than any other country in the world. Would I be right to say, okay, heterodox now is more of like socialism? Thank you.
Do we have another? Okay. Many thanks for these great questions again. I will start with the final one. There is no free trade in China. China got rich not only because it had some good endowments in terms of being a huge country, having a huge population and being a powerhouse in Asia, but also because it tried to impose its own rules on the globalization process. For example, I think it's still not possible as a foreigner to own a firm in China. This is very different from how do it here. So China from the very beginning said, we will probably be exploited if we do it following the neoclassical textbook. So we have to open up selectively. We have to protect our ownership. We have to use protectionist measures to build up our productive capacities. So in many, although in some ways China has become less socialist through this opening up since the 1980s, the way and the playbook by which this opening up of China, or this greater opening up of China, was organized and orchestrated was very much heterodox in spirit, okay? Or at least pluralist, I would say. And I would also argue that China, although I'm not very knowledgeable on this, is a sphere where you have some breathing space for heterodox ideas also in academia. But these guys do not have too much connections with the rest of the world very often, which makes it difficult to really have an accurate picture. But I would argue that China has become rich in part because it did not follow many provisions that come from this standard neoclassical free trade benefits us all approach. Then the second question, global north, global south divide. Of course, this is very visible. I tried to pointed it by emphasizing how a large share, I mean, there's even discrimination against Europeans, you could say, because such a large share of authors, especially in the top journals, comes from the US. And this is because the editors of these journals are from the US, and these guys are typically of the conviction that you need a US PhD program to be a serious economist. And against this background, you have these large US buyers, and basically a close to zero representation of the global south if it takes only the 5 leading journals or so. So this is really extremely lopsided, and this of course also feeds back on the outcomes we have, because we do not have much awareness for basically how the economic situation in the global south looks like. There are, of course, exceptions, and one of these exceptions is maybe Danny Roderick, who is a neoclassical economist, but also a dissenter, a little bit like Piketty. And he one has to admit, he did a very good study on representation by country. So I think in this case, we have one of the self-critical mainstreamers that gives us really the best data on this, where we clearly see this close to zero representation of the global south. And this has nothing to do with intellectual capabilities, of course, because if you look in other disciplines that are maybe much harder than economics, we have a more equal or a greater representation of global south countries. So there is some kind of cultural or political connotation to that. Regional variations in orthodox dominance. I mean, I come from a country, Austria, that has some heterodox tradition. But that's probably not the also the UK, one has to admit, still has, because of this Cambridge and so, still has a comparatively strong heterodox tradition. In global terms, I would also have mentioned India. I think you have a point there with the, I think, Economic and Political Weekly or so, this magazine. So basically, I mean, they are great scholars. They also have some universities to use as a base, and then they have this kind of very visible, also political outlet, I would say. So many political and economic commentaries that create visibility, and they also manage to, at least that's my impression, probably you know that much better, they also have some impact on policy discourses. Although my hunch would be that with Modi this has diminished, but maybe you know more about that. Yeah, and then finally, I think the clearest example that comes to my mind is South America, because in South America you have this tradition of structuralism, and in structuralism was always emphasizing this idea of unequal exchange in international trade and of unfair prices and so. And they also have this UN Commission for the UN ECLAC, it's called, the Economic Commission for Latin American Countries, which is basically a UN facility in Santiago de Chile and some 2 or 3 other places, which cultivates this structuralist approach since 6 decades. And this is a reason why you find many economists in South America that at least know what heterodox economics is about, and also many more that are convinced that this is the right approach as compared to other continents. So this would be really an example of what could also maybe be an archetype for Africa, because I think it really makes a difference on how economic expertise plays out in practical terms. So when it comes to curricular change, when it comes to appointments, but also when it comes to policy. The impact of orthodox super authors was another question. I think this is a question where we could do another talk. Howard and I, mainly Howard, will also address this point in the talk we do in the afternoon, but in my view there are at least 2 stories to tell. One is the story about the emergence of neoliberalism as a major ideology from 1980 to 2020 or so, or maybe still alive and well. And neoliberalism was a joint product of 2 economic approaches, namely neoclassical economics on the one hand, and the Austrian school of economics on the other hand, as Friedrich, von Hayek and Mises and this approach. This approach by Hayek is actually not really compatible In analytic terms, with neoclassical economics, they have some hard points of contention, but in political terms, where we say we need a small government, a small state, we need free and deregulated markets, we should not care about income distribution and the like. In these terms, these two approaches, these two paradigms are very well communicating. And when we tell this story about the emergence of neoliberalism as a core ideology, we probably should at least start 1947 with the foundation of the Makerere Société. Basically, after World War II, radical liberals met in Switzerland and decided to create a network of think tanks by which they planned to influence policy. And this plan worked out over the next 60 years. And in this story, you also have many examples of the stuff that Howard mentions, where basically rich elites found that the ideas of neoclassical economists are conducive to their interests, which then led to funding. And this funding was mainly used not for research, but for promoting political ideas. And there are today, I think, in this network, there are on the globe over 300 or 400 think tanks in this network that emerged from this conference at Makerere. So you could do a talk on that. And I think, of course, the second main story that should be told is the story about the international organizations, IMF, World Bank, and so on, where it actually, parallel to the eclipse of Keynesianism in the history of economics I showed, so basically starting with the 1980s, also neoclassical recipes were used as a blueprint for designing reform programs for indebted countries, but also reform programs for countries that wanted to do a regime switch. So for example, the famous example of the shock therapy in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. The shock therapy is an interesting example also with our core subject, wealth inequality. Before, still in communism, wealth inequality in the Soviet area was probably the lowest all on the globe. And after shock therapy, after 5, 6, 7 years of shock therapy, Russia became the most unequal country in the world. Why? Because basically all the assets that were collectively held were then sold after the fall, after the end of the Soviet Union. And in this process of primitive accumulation, some smart individuals appropriated the right shares, and these are now the oligarchs. So basically, with Russia, you really see this impact from where basically neoclassical ideas of how to distribute property, collective property to the population, led to a switch that made Russia from the most equal country on the planet to the most unequal country on this planet. So I think here you have it very clearly. So 2 more talks to prepare when taking this question seriously. I leave it at that. Many thanks.
Thanks, Prof. We would like to continue with the conversation for maybe 5 or more minutes because, again, lunch is not ready, but feel free to relax or step out if you wish to. I will take another round of questions, and I would like to begin with myself before I come to you. I have one comment, Professor, about inequality and land acquisition and rising inequality in Uganda. Is there an approach, or what are your thoughts on how we can use governance, especially in the form of good governance and democratic processes of representation, which are mostly seemingly a tool for neoliberal systems of government to really remedy the inequality? And my comment is about the same. Do we really need a 1,000 years textbooks to resolve the problems of inequality today? The presentation yesterday indicated that income and wealth accumulation, for example, in virtual space now, don't really depend on old age ideas. Are there any possibilities of ideas how inequality can really be reduced without necessarily reading Adam Smith or any heterodox 100-year-old textbooks. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to ask, so you mentioned that in, for example, development studies, heterodox ideas are cited actually quite a lot, and that's also what I perceive. For example, when it comes to free trade, I feel like it's a mainstream take actually in development studies that neoclassic ideas or neoliberal ideas don't work, and it's actually strongly rejected. But then it doesn't, I feel like it doesn't actually transform into the policies, because the policies we execute, at least in the global north, they continue to be very neoliberal, very neoclassical. Looking at the EU trade agreements, free trade agreements between African regions, for example, I don't know, ECOWAS and the EU. And so I wonder, how do we cross that threshold of like, okay, this is a mainstream take in academia, but how do we feed this into our policies? Thank you.
I would like to take one more if there is another question. If not, I invite you to respond, Professor Jakob.
Yeah, very nice. Thanks again for the great questions. The short answer to your question is, to your second question is no. It's not a prerequisite or a necessary requirement to read all texts. But I think what is necessary for really tackling inequality is to broaden the vista. And for this, and to get out of this neoclassical cage. And I think for this, simply the deliberative and discursive interaction and talking about heterodox ideas is important. So one personal example from my career is I have repeatedly done estimations for a wealth tax in Austria or Europe. How much would a wealth tax bring for the budget? Would it be sufficiently, what would be rates that would help us reduce wealth inequality, questions like that. And when we came up with that, basically everybody, policymakers and economists all said we were crazy. Because in neoclassical economics, you typically do not talk about wealth. It's very niche topic. And thinking about wealth was alien to them, but also